The modern U.S. government shutdown is a form of high-stakes political conflict enabled by a unique legal interpretation, sustained by a system of public finance and governed by the logic of brinkmanship and blame game politics. I've been thinking how the contemporary U.S. government shutdown is a uniquely American political accidental institution. Not unlike the filibuster, born not of constitutional design, but of a pivotal legal reinterpretation in the late 20th century. This reinterpretation weaponized fiscal law, and it created a powerful tool for political conflict that has no direct parallel in other democracies. The roots of the shutdown lie in the Anti-Deficiency Act, the ADA, a 19th century law with an original purpose far removed from what its modern application has been. Enacted in various forms after the Civil War, the ADA was designed to impose fiscal discipline on the executive branch and reassert Congress' constitutional power of the purse, paradoxically. It was designed to prevent agencies, particularly the military, from creating coercive deficiencies, as they were called at the time, intentionally obligating funds beyond their appropriation to force Congress to provide supplemental funding to avoid breaching contracts. For nearly a century, this law functioned as intended. During occasional lapses in appropriations, federal agencies largely continued their operations, curtailing non-essential spending with the shared understanding that Congress would eventually provide the necessary funds. These funding gaps were treated as administrative problems to be managed, not as triggers for a systemic cessation of government services. This long-standing practice changed in the 1980s and 81. In response to a query from President Jimmy Carter and part of a conflict that he was having with the Republican Party at the time, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti issued a two-legal opinion that single-handedly created the modern shutdown mechanism. He argues for a strict and unambiguous interpretation of the ADA, concluding that without specific appropriation from Congress, it was illegal for a federal agency to continue operations or incur financial obligations. Crucially, a subsequent opinion carved out a critical exception permitting the continuation of functions related to emergencies involving the safety of human life or the protection of property. This legal distinction is the direct origin of the entire framework of essential or accepted versus non-essential government activities and employees that defines contemporary shutdowns. The Civiletti opinions fundamentally re-engineered the strategic landscape of American fiscal negotiations. By making continued government operations illegal during a funding gap, they introduced a new powerful and dangerous, previously non-existent alternative for legislative action: the ability to unilaterally trigger a partial cessation of government functions. This transformation of what had been a standard legislative negotiation into a high-stakes game of chicken, where the default outcome of non-agreement was no longer status quo operations, but a crash in the form of the shutdown. Even Civiletti later expressed that his legal advice had been repurposed as a political gambit in ways he could have never imagined. The institutional structure stands in stark contrast to most parliamentary systems. In countries like the United Kingdom or Canada, the legislative body's failure to pass a budget is typically treated as a vote of no confidence. Such an event does not trigger the shutdown of public services. Instead, it signals a loss of government authority and leads to a dissolution of the government itself, prompting a new general election. That means if these two parties could not agree on a budget, this fundamental difference in institutional design, where a budget failure triggers government collapse rather than service collapse, is why the shutdown remains a uniquely American phenomenon. Now, let's be very clear, as any Fed knows. The term government shutdown, it's a misnomer. The government does not cease to operate. That's the lie. Rather, what happens during a so-called government shutdown is that it shifts the financial burden of its core functions onto its own workforce, the same one that has been so aggravated this year, extracting what is, in effect, a zero-interest, involuntary, and uncompensated loan from every federal employee. During a shutdown, a significant portion of the federal workforce, actually the majority, is legally compelled to work without pay. These accepted employees, 800,000, includes personnel critical to national security, public safety, commerce, such as ATC, TSA, FBI, Border Patrol, but also Treasury, the people issuing currency, issuing money, so the banking system can operate. The scale of this financial is substantial. According to an analysis in October 2024 2025, the shutdown will probably cost between $21 billion of missing wages for civilian employees alone. That is, it's a loan of at least $21 billion paid in labor, for which the government pays zero interest, and it is subsidized by the federal government. This arrangement forces public servants to personally finance the continued operation of the state, providing their labor as immediate interest-free loan to the United States Treasury. This system of accepted employees functions as a direct government subsidy to political brinkmanship. So the paradox is not only it funds the government, it funds polarization. It externalizes the immediate operational costs of the shutdown from the U.S. Treasury onto the personal balance sheets of federal workers. Instead of borrowing on the open market and incurring interest, the government forces its employees to provide labor on credit. These employees, in turn, must rely on high-interest personal debt to manage their own finances, effectively absorbing the borrowing costs that the government avoids. This creates a cost-free window for political actors, lowering the perceived fiscal barrier to initiating and prolonging a shutdown. A government shutdown is not a static event, but a dynamic process of systemic decay. The stability of the involuntary loan extracted from the federal workforce is finite, and its erosion follows a predictable trajectory. The system's breaking point is a phased cascade of financial failure within the essential workforce, leading directly to the degradation of critical public services. This process can be modeled in, I consider, 4 distinct phases, where the first one, we can see the increasing credit balances, where federal employees use minimal savings and mostly run their credit cards. By the depletion of their credit availability and liquid savings, they start to apply for unemployment, relying on food banks, as we've seen already happening in some areas in the country. Once the loan defaults begin, once federal workers cannot pay their mortgage, cannot pay their basic car payments, at that point, the rational choice shifts from unpaid federal work seeking median income, right? So literally going out and driving for Ubers, looking for other jobs that do pay money because they cannot keep funding the government. It is only at that point, and much later in the process, that widespread default and a financial crisis might happen. This is when we start to see an actual shutdown, many weeks, even months after the beginning of the process. The 2019 shutdown proved the empirical evidence for this model. That's kind of the one that I'm using to model it. Approximately 3 weeks without pay was the long period that TSA officers had before they started to declare unable to continue the work, right, with more than 15% of the workforce not being present, disrupting major airports, which actually was the trigger that ended the shutdown at that time. The interesting thing is that the phased collapse of public services is not an unforeseen consequence of the shutdown. It is its central feature that enables the political strategy itself. The system of unpaid essential labor creates a buffer that allows political actors to engage in high-risk tactics with delayed accountability, a dynamic best explained by the concepts in game theory of moral hazard and brinkmanship. The involuntary loan from the federal employees acts as a direct political subsidy to the parties engaged in the conflict. Because critical systems like air traffic control and law enforcement do not fail immediately, there is no overwhelming public backlash in the initial weeks of the shutdown. In fact, one senator was saying, you see, nothing happens. Why do we even have all this government if we can shut it down and nothing changes? This period of relative stability creates a political runway, giving both sides the breathing room to engage in protracted high-stakes negotiations without facing immediate and intolerable consequences from the electorate. The true costs are hidden, deferred, and borne by a specific segment of the population, the federal workforce. This political structure creates a classic moral hazard problem, a concept drawn from principal agent theory, where an agent is insulated from the full consequences of their risky decisions. In this scenario, the public and federal employees are the principals who bear the costs, while elected officials are the agents who make the decisions. The shutdown mechanism shields politicians, at least at the short term, from the immediate tangible harms of their strategy. such as financial ruin for the federal workers and the slow degradation of services. This insulation encourages more risk-seeking behavior that would occur if the political actors themselves bore those costs directly. This moral hazard, what in strategy we called a game of chicken, is defined by pushing a dangerous situation to the verge of disaster to force an opponent to concede. As a tactic, gamesmanship involves the deliberate creation of a risk that one doesn't really control. That's part of the point. A government shutdown is a perfect vehicle for this strategy. By initiating and prolonging the impasse, political leaders are deliberately letting the situation get somewhat out of hand on purpose, gambling that the escalating system failure will become more intolerable to their adversary first. Think the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the shared risk of mutual catastrophe was used as leverage between the Soviet Union and the United States. The legal exception for essential services, originally intended to protect public safety, has paradoxically become the primary enabler of this political dysfunction. The initial furlough of non-essential employees creates political pressure without triggering a systemic crisis. Meanwhile, the forced continuation of essential services prevents the immediate catastrophic collapse that would compel a swift resolution. This two-tiered system acts as a shock absorber, creating the crucial buffer of time that allows the political conflict to escalate through the phases of degradation, transforming the shutdown from a potential emergency into a sustainable multi-week political weapon. A government shutdown is not merely a failure to reach an agreement. It is an active strategic choice made when at least one party concludes that the political damage from not having a shutdown is greater than the damage from having one. In negotiation theory, a party's power is derived from its BATNA, its best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The BATNA is a course of action a negotiator will pursue if current talks fail. Your BATNA when you go and buy a car is not buying the car, right? So that's all, you can always walk away. A strong BATNA allows a party to negotiate aggressively and walk away from a bad deal, while a weak BATNA, you really need that car today, forces them to accept a less favorable term. The decision to trigger a shutdown is a decision to deploy one BATNAs. I walk away from the fiscal negotiation. It is important to remember that this shutdown was preceded by a period where the Democratic leadership decided that their BATNA was to avoid the shutdown. In March 2025, their strategic calculation was that funding the government, even under Republican administration, was a better outcome than the shutdown. This assessment was based on the belief that other institutions, such as the courts, could serve as a check on executive power, and that a shutdown would be a counterproductive political tool. In this context, their BATNA was to fund the government and fight through other channels. Fear of Doge and what President Trump would do during the shutdown convinced the minority leader in the Senate to avoid the shutdown. A strategic inversion has now occurred, given the behaviors of the administration and some court decisions by the courts. As the Democratic leadership concluded that other institutional checks had failed, and that the administration was engaged in what they termed authoritarian consolidation, a negotiated agreement, continued government funding was no longer viewed as a neutral or positive outcome, but reframed as a negative one, complicity in actions that they deemed illegitimate. Consequently, the BATNA's calculations inverted. The alternative to a shutdown was no longer restraint, but financing an autocratic takeover, in their opinion. The shutdown itself, despite its known economic and social costs, was reevaluated and became the new superior BATNA. It was now seen as the only remaining tool powerful enough to create a national attentional moment and force a public confrontation over the administration's actions. The impasse began at the precise moment when, for one party, the perceived utility of deploying their BATNA, the shutdown, exceeded the perceived utility of negotiating an agreement and continuing the funding. Therefore, the resulting political standoff is a complex strategic interaction that can be modeled using several complementary game theoretic frameworks. The overarching structure is a war of attrition. We kind of described already. The public messaging is governed by a blame game politics, and the underlying high-stakes dynamic is a game of chicken. The first part, the war of attrition, means that we're dealing with a dynamic timing game in which players incur continuous costs in an effort to outlast an opponent and win a prize. In this political context, the players are the Republican and the White House coalition and the Democratic coalition. The prize is twofold: achieving specific goals, cementing budget cuts for Republicans, extending ACA subsidies for Democrats, but more critically, forcing the other side to capitulate, therefore winning the public blame game and establishing a reputation for resolve. The cost is the escalating and degrading political and economic damage generating by the shutdown's progression through the phases of time degradation as described before. Each day the shutdown continues, both sides pay a cost in the form of rising public anger, measurable economic harm, and the risk of fracture within their own political coalitions. The conflict persists because each side calculates that the accumulating cost will eventually become intolerable for the opponent, forcing a concession. On the one hand, the Republican strategy is built on two pillars: a simple public message and a bet on their opponent's internal weakness. First, the strategy employs blame game politics, a model where legislative conflict is deliberately provoked to signal positions to outside audiences. The Republicans' core tactic is to propose a clean continuing resolution. In fact, they did it and then they closed the House to fund the government at existing levels. This allows them to frame their position as simple, reasonable, and portray Democrats as radical hostage takers manufacturing a crisis over unrelated partisans' wish lists. Second, that was the first pillar. The second is it's a strategic bet. It's a war of attrition. The key strategic wager is that the Democratic coalition will break first under the pressure of the shutdown. The public call from the American Federation of Government Employees, a major federal worker union and traditional Democratic ally, for Congress to pass a clean CR is an example of this. It signals to Republicans that the Democrat strategy is inflicting significant pain on their own base, reinforcing the belief that by holding firm they can win the war of attrition. In fact, the second leg of that one was the series of layoffs that the administration tried to blame on the shutdown. So what is the GOP's BADNA at this point? The shutdown serves the administration's interests by creating a power vacuum, enable executive actions like budget reconfiguration and threats of mass firings that would be more difficult on their normal appropriation process, but not impossible as we saw before. On the other hand, the Democratic strategy is more complex, relying on a specific policy argument and a time-sensitive trigger to shift public opinion. First, their blame game approach requires them to re-educate the public that the clean CR is a dirty lie, as they have called it. They argue that recent legislation has already enacted deep cuts to programs like Medicaid and specifically to the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and a clean CR would actually codify those cuts as the new baseline, changing the baseline to that position, moving the Overton window. Their blame game message is therefore focused on a tangible kitchen table crisis. Republicans are blocking a deal which will cause millions of Americans' health insurance premiums to skyrocket when ACA subsidies expire. If we reopen the government, all of these expiration rules will enter into effect, and this would be unacceptable. Their strategic bet is a war of attrition too. Their entire strategy hinges on a hard deadline: the expiration of Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies on December 3rd. As open enrollment begins, millions of voters are already receiving right now official notices that their premiums are about to skyrocket between 75 to 114% or more. The challenge of the Democratic Party is to connect that increase with the shutdown. This external event is calculated to dramatically increase the political cost of the shutdown for the party in power. Democrats are betting that this focused personal financial pain is a more potent political weapon than the diffuse public frustration with the shutdown itself. A bet so far supported by polling data showing strong support for extending the subsidies. This is why even Republican congresspeople like Marjorie Taylor Greene have mentioned that they would support a change in legislation to reinstitute some version of the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Beneath the long-term war of attrition, the moment-to-moment negotiation is a high-stakes game of chickens. Remember Back to the Future 1? Both parties are driving towards the crash of systemic failure, each daring the other to yield first. To capitulate on core demands, Republicans agreeing to fund ACA subsidies or Democrats accepting the clean CR, is to swerve. This means losing the policy fight and, more importantly, being branded as a chicken by their political base, damaging the reputation for future conflicts. So this conflict is mostly about the conflicts to come, specifically the midterm elections. If the opponent swerves, the winner achieves their policy goal and secures a significant political victory, reinforcing the reputation for toughness. If neither side swerves, the system enters the systemic crash phase, resulting in a catastrophic failure of core government services. This is a massive lose-lose outcome where both sides risk being held responsible by the public for the disaster. The entire negotiation is therefore a gamble on which party the public will blame more in the event of a full-scale systemic collapse. The resulting impasse is a strategy stalemate where, for a time, the perceived political cost of capitulation outweighs the perceived cost of continued conflict. This dangerous equilibrium holds until the mounting pressure of impending systemic failure forces one side to swerve in the high-stakes game of chicken. Unfortunately, in this era of high polarization, what this demonstrates is that the shutdown and the pain that it's inflicting and is about to inflict is not a sign of political breakdown, but a political system functioning precisely as it's currently designed to do. Altering this outcome would require institutional reforms such as automatic continuing resolutions or an immediate collapse of all, not just a few, government functions, making the impact of the shutdown immediately painful or impossible altogether. In the meantime, the conditions are such that the incentives for parties to back down are still low because that loan that we talked about before, given by the federal employees to the government in the form of their uncompensated labor, creates a window of opportunity for them to stay the course. So as the federal workforce depletes its savings and borrowing capacity, that loan will become untenable and the dynamic might change.